Hello and welcome to the Save Your Sanity live stream. Today we're having an in-depth talk with Sandy Kirkham, Sandy Phillips Kirkham. She is someone whose story you will soon hear and why you will understand why we're talking about spiritual abuse, because it is real, it is sad, and it is betraying, and it can affect you deeply in so many ways. So welcome, Sandy.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's great to be here with you. And everybody, you can find Sandy at sandyphillipskirkham.com. It's there on the screen for you. And Sandy, tell people why you are so interested in the topic of spiritual abuse.
Well, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor at the age of 16. I was very active in the church. It was a place that I found such joy and peace. I loved being there. My parents didn't attend church. I went with a neighbor, and everything about it. I taught Sunday school. I sang in the choir. I was baptized at age 13. Shortly after I turned 16, our church hired this new youth pastor, and he was really different than anybody we'd ever met. He was charismatic. He was very dynamic with his speaking. He was 30 and married with 2 children, but he acted more like the kids. He was kind of what you'd say in the 70s vernacular hip. He had sideburns. He drove a convertible. He knew our music. So he was just very different. And people were just drawn to him. He had a way about him that people wanted to please him. They wanted to be around him. Our church started growing in number. He tapped into me to be one of the leaders in the youth group. And it was after a youth group meeting at my house that he stopped me after everyone left and told me how wonderful I was and how great the work I was doing in the church. And then he bent down and he kissed me. And I was shocked. I remember thinking, I think he just kissed me. But I knew he was my pastor. So I thought, well, he wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. So I just justified it that this was his way of showing appreciation, because it was kind of this innocent kind of a kiss. But eventually there was about a year of grooming where he spent building me up, telling me how wonderful I was, and he was putting me in positions of leadership. And the kissing became a little more frequent. He was giving me more hugs until one night he eventually had sex with me. And that point on, it changed the relationship. I knew that that was wrong. And all of a sudden, I was no longer this wonderful person. He became very critical of me. He controlled how I dressed, where I could go, what friends I could see. He began to isolate me. It was a physically abusive as well as emotional. And that went on for 5 years until he was found out by the couple of people in the church. And sadly, they covered it up and they moved him to the next church. They gave him a going away party. I was told by the elders that I was to leave the church because of my behavior. And I was devastated. It was a place that I just absolutely loved. It was my whole life. And I couldn't believe that I was being told because of my behavior, I was no longer fit to worship in that church. Because, I saw that he had been forgiven. He had been given a second chance. And I didn't deserve that same kind of treatment. And so I've told people, many times that while his abuse for me, what he did to me was horrible, the reaction of the church probably had more of an effect on my spiritual life than his own actions. So that's kind of the story in a very quick nutshell. I mean, there's a lot more to the story and a lot more that went on through that 5 years. But the damage done spiritually to me lasted a lifetime.
Oh, for sure. And tell people about your book.
I wrote a book about my experience. It's called Let Me Pray Upon You. It is, well, actually, I've got a copy here, but it's Prey. So that's the book. It was a difficult book to write in many ways, but in some ways it was very healing as well. And I wrote the book for 2 reasons. One, I was frustrated by the lack of understanding of clergy abuse and the dynamics involved in how these perpetrators work, and people didn't understand. So I wrote it for that purpose, but I also wrote it for other victims because as I began to tell my story, I would have so many people say to me, you need to tell your story because it's an important story and it's a powerful one and it would help others.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember thinking, what if I had heard someone's story when my own abuse had been happening? Maybe it would have given me the courage to come forward to tell someone. Maybe it would have given me the courage to be able to break away from this man's abuse. But I thought I was the only one that this was happening to, or that no one else was experiencing the same kind of thing that I was experiencing. So I hope that by telling my own story, that someone who is either going through abuse or has been abused can draw something from my story to help them heal in their own way.
Yes, and I have a copy of the book. It's excellent, and as I had on the screen here, if you're interested, you can get it at Amazon, I'm sure. But also, you want to visit Sandy's website at sandyphillipskirkham.com. So let's generalize this because we're going to intermingle ideas of spiritual abuse with your story and your advocacy, Sandy. So spiritual abuse really is when someone uses spiritual or religious beliefs to hurt, scare, or control you. That would be the general definition. But I brought a few points from the National Domestic Violence Hotline about spiritual abuse. So I thought everyone listening to the call might find differing pieces of this that they could identify with. So here is what they said. Spiritual abuse when one ridicules or insults another person's beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
When someone tries to prevent a person from practicing their spiritual or religious beliefs. When someone uses those beliefs to manipulate or shame someone, when someone forces a child to be raised in a faith that the other parent did not agree to, and when someone uses beliefs or texts to minimize or rationalize abusive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that happen. I had a pastor, I have a similar story to Sandy's in terms of I took myself to church and I was happy there and did everything there because I wasn't happy at home. So I was having a wonderful time, but the wonderful minister left and we got another one. Now, he never hurt anybody in the congregation that I know of, but because my parents were very difficult, they like to associate with people they felt had power. So they used to have the minister and his wife come to the house all the time. So occasionally the minister's wife would come without the minister. And it was then that I got the idea and understood that he beat his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very, very difficult. He was a horrible man. He said horrible things. He did horrible things, but they weren't sexual in nature to anybody. But spiritual belief is when somebody believes that they can use, or
Right.
spiritual abuse, they can use your beliefs against you, can use them to shame you or manipulate you. But I love that last piece, so pertinent to your story, Sandy, that they use the beliefs or text to minimize or rationalize
Their behavior.
abusive behavior. So very important for us to understand. And it's kind of a special place in hell that this occurs because you believe that this is a safe place. This is supposed to be your sanctuary. After all, they call those churches sanctuaries, and then you find that you're unsafe. So there's a lot to talk about, and people are already talking about it. So let's just see. Joan says, "Wow," to your story, and then said, "Had you fallen in love with him?"
Um, I thought that I was because he told me that I was in love with him. He told me that he loved me. He also, as you talked about the scripture and misuse of scripture, he would tell me this was God's will, that we were married in God's eyes. And, I'm looking at this pastor as someone that I should trust and I should believe. It's a confusion time. So I eventually accepted his abusive behavior as his love for me, and that I did love him. And I actually protected him when his actions were discovered. I didn't want anything bad to happen to him. And so I protected him in many ways, even till the end. And then, of course, I was removed from the church. And he,
Yeah.
of course, did not stand up for me for that.
Well, of course not. And we're talking about people who are toxic, and everybody on my channel knows that that's who I talk about all the time. So we're talking about hijackal pastor in this case, but there are lots of people who are not in places of authority and churches who will use spiritual abuse against you. And so it's a very open conversation that we're having. If you have questions for us, certainly put them in the chat, or if you had something to share. This is an open conversation, and we're glad that you're here. And Ursel said, I've never seen this before. Is it psycho or sociopathic? Well, we don't know. I don't know these people, but the behavior is definitely narcissistic.
Yes,
Power over.
absolutely.
Definitely narcissistic, could have other things going on, but I don't know these people. But the answer, Sal, is this is a narcissistic abuse. It is, I am stronger, wiser, better, and superior to you, and I will show you how I am.
And that was the
And
case with me, especially. In the beginning, before the abuse actually happened, he put me on a pedestal. He told me how wonderful I was. After the sexual encounter, I became someone who wasn't very smart. He didn't like the way I dressed. He thought he had me memorize a vocabulary word every week and give him the definition, under the guise that he was trying to help me and grow education wise. But that was his control over me, to say, you're not very smart, so you need to start learning new vocabulary words every week. He needed to make himself feel better about himself by making me feel less about myself. And I eventually got to a point where I had no self-esteem whatsoever.
yeah,
I felt guilty for what was happening. I knew this was wrong, but I had no idea of how to get away from it. He threatened me that if I were to tell anyone, I would be responsible for what would happen. And of course, I was old enough to understand that if I were to tell anyone, this was going to be a huge bombshell into this
mm-hmm.
church. He was like a cult leader, and everyone loved him. And so, I was going to be shattering all of their beliefs if I were to ever tell anybody what was
Yeah.
happening. So yes, they're very narcissistic, and they need that control and power.
Mm-hmm. And as I say so often about hijackals, they paint a public picture of perfection, while to those really close to them, they provide a private place of pain.
Mm-hmm.
So big shiny on the outside, kind of rotten on the inside. And that's what we're talking about here, that spirit that they have within them that needs power and control over other humans in order to feel worthy and to raise themselves up to feel more powerful. And that is sad. It is definitely dysfunctional. And when we see it, when we hear it, when we experience it, we need to be able to call it what it is. And in this case, it is spiritual abuse. If anybody uses spiritual matters to hurt you or scare you, control you, manipulate you, it is spiritual abuse. And Kendi says it's real. That's what they do. They reel you in, then they crush you.
Right.
So it sounds like Kendi has had some first or secondhand experience with that. And Ursel wants you to know that she has a lot of empathy for you. Oh, Kendi says, I suffered this for 6 years. I finally left in October. Yay, Kendi,
Yes.
good for
Yeah.
you. That's
That's not
great.
easy. That's
No.
not an easy thing to do.
No, it
Yeah.
isn't. Because just as Sandy experienced, they will turn the tables on you, and you will be out, and
Mhm.
the abuser will be in. I
And one of
don't
the other things that he told me, which again, it's very methodical and systematic, that they continually, the gaslighting that goes on, they into the point where you believe their lies. But he would continually tell me, I'm the only one that can love you. No one is going to love you the way I do. And then he would throw it up into my face that I wasn't a virgin any longer, and therefore I wasn't even, worthy of love of anyone else. And so, I began to believe that. And so it's at one point, I gave up and just realized this was going to be my life, that I would be stuck in this relationship forever. I would never get married. I would never have children, and it would be over when he said it was over.
yeah, and that is so unfortunately common. because you get that flip-flop. I took your virginity, but now
Mhm.
you're less than, you're not good enough for any other person. So then you think, well, I better stick with this one. I'll never
Right.
have another opportunity. And you're young, you're impressionable. Everybody knows, because I talk about it all the time, your brain grows till you're 30,
Yeah.
not much after 25. But when somebody gets to you when you're 5 or 12 or 15, you're not fully developed. So people are still influencing you, and those in authority, you believe, right?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
so it gets really, really tricky. And we don't want to believe sometimes that spiritual abuse happens.
Right.
It's sort of, we want to deny that. You had some of that. The congregation didn't want to believe it. They moved him. We've had lots of examples of that in churches of recent times, where they just move people every time that they're abusive, or schools. Somebody's charged with abuse by a student or by a parishioner, a congregant, and then, oh, we'll just move the
Mhm.
minister.
Mhm.
We'll do that. And that is just
That's spiritual
incredible.
abuse. That's
It
also
is.
spiritual
It
abuse.
is, because it's demonstrating no concern for those who were left behind.
Right. And those
Eh,
in the future that will be abused. When he left our church, it was in a very short time. He was having inappropriate relationships with a 20-year-old in the church, and then he moved. They finally let that denomination said he could lost all of his standing in the church. He went to another denomination and continued with inappropriate misconduct throughout his entire career, and he's still a pastor. He's still in
Yeah.
ministry, which
Mhm.
shows you, as you well know, the power that these men have over other people, and that they can control the people around them to the point where they will not discipline them. And they
No, I
know that.
know.
And they know
Yeah.
that.
Yes, and I've had a different experience than you. I was a divorced mother with 3 children on my own, and I used to play the piano for a lot of churches, organs and things. I would go from church to church whenever they were missing somebody. And I had been participating, singing on a TV show. And so I had met these people from a very fundamentalist church. And so I lived in a small town between 2 much larger towns. And there I was, a little bit later, captive with my 3 kids, working full time, trying to make ends meet, right? And 2 men from 2 different groups, each time they went through town, they would drop by my house at 11 o'clock at
Mm,
night just to see how I was.
yeah.
And, oh, they were very forceful, and they tried to use all kinds of tricks and manipulations to get into my house. And the answer was, "Absolutely not. You can come by calling sometime, bringing your wife, I'll make tea. Go
Right.
away." Right? But they felt that because I was a sitting duck, in a
Right.
sense, that they could just drop by and just tell me how wonderful, beautiful, etc. I was, but how sad it was that I was such a wreck after being divorced. Now, believe me, I was no wreck. I was
Yeah.
happy. I got away from a hijackal. I was happy. But there I am, looking at these people who are professing to be the pillars of life, having all the answers and telling other people how to do it. And they're dropping by my home
Yeah.
at 11 o'clock at night. So Isabel says, "Hi, Isabel. I know a narc pastor." Yes, unfortunately, I know a few. Um, Ursel says, "That's gross, Sandy." What church?
Well,
Well,
it happened in the Church of Christ Christian Church, and that was the denomination I was in. And then he now is in the Disciples of Christ, which is kind of a shoot off of the Church of Christ, but they are separate. But he's in the Disciples of Christ Church now.
well, it just reminded me when you said the first church. I was in Japan, and I had to wait in line to get some money, and this man started chatting me up. And then he said, "You're so lovely. I'm here and I'm going to be moving around with my ministry, and I'm the head of this church. It was a church of God. And I think that you should go home and get your children and come and travel with me."
My.
That was all in a half hour standing in a lineup in Tokyo.
But
Right?
they look for vulnerable people. So,
Yes.
your situation, that it may have appeared to them that you were in this vulnerable place and that you would have easily gone with him. And they test that. That's what they do. They look for people who are in emotional crisis or who have a need, and they pretend to fill that need only to take advantage of you down the road.
Oh, exactly. And,
Yeah.
of course, at that point, I was 24 years old. I had a child, and I said, "Well, no,
Yeah.
of course not." And he
That
was like,
happened.
"Well, why not? Why not? It's a wonderful thing. I'll pay for everything."
Yeah.
Absolutely wild. So Kendi says, "That's how I felt about my old church. So glad I'm out. It's like a twilight zone. Yay, I was 17, 18, now 24, and happy at my new church. Unfortunately, my mom isn't happy about me leaving. She has BPD, by a borderline personality disorder." Well, of course not. Your mom's not going to be happy, Candy, because as you know, she has to be right.
Mhm.
So therefore, she's in the right place, and you did the wrong thing by leaving for whatever reason.
Mhm.
And we all know that people who have hijackal behaviors are always in competition with you. So therefore, that was expressed there. Thanks herself. She says, "Well done." Joan said, "I'm trying to work through the discard." Yeah, that's a difficult one. Even being discarded from an abusive relationship is tough, because if you're in a relationship with any hijackal, there's abuse and you can be discarded. But then that double discard for you, Sandy,
Yeah.
when you were discarded by the guy, but then you were discarded by the congregation.
Right. And that, like I said, that was the most devastating part for me, because it was a place that, I believed that I could be forgiven. And I didn't have anything to be forgiven for, but I at that point, felt like, I have every right to be in this church as well. And I saw how they treated him. So I expected that, at least the minimum of treatment. And it
Yeah.
was just devastating to me. But, I recognized too that he had given the narrative of what had happened. So I don't know what he told them. He lied to them, I'm sure. So, but
Sure.
they never asked me any questions. They told me I had to sit in church in a certain place. I was not to talk to anyone. I wasn't allowed to tell my parents. It was probably handled in the most inappropriate way possible. Now, I do want to say that part of my healing was that I eventually confronted my abuser 27 years later. I hired a private
Mm.
investigator and confronted him. But I also went back to my former church and asked for a meeting of the elders.
Good.
And not that any of them were there on the board at the time, some of them were at the church at the time, but that church needed to acknowledge the wrong they had done to me.
Uh,
And I needed them to understand the truth and hear the truth. And so they were very gracious in allowing me to have that meeting. And so that was very instrumental in my own healing, to be able to look at those men and say to them, what you did to me was wrong, and it should never have happened, and you need to own it. And they did. And they did.
Yay. So we're all giving you props for that. For all of us who have ever been abused. Good for you. So, Ursel said, it's funny how we can fill a role without even knowing it.
Mm.
We can be slotted in by somebody else's manipulation. And Candy said, however, my wake-up call to leave was when I started getting physically sick from all the stress in June.
Mm.
That's when I started to plan to leave. Thank you guys for the video, because no one talks about this. For years, I felt like I was the crazy one. Well, big hearts to you too, Candy,
Mhm.
because you had the strength to do it. You stood up to it, and you left, and you did what was best and right for you. And you will certainly know what these are at any time you get into another situation. Just so important. So good for you. There's also very healing to go back. Good for you. And Kendi says, amen, Ms. Phillips.
Thank you.
A
Wasn't
strong
easy.
woman. No,
Yeah.
no,
I
it
mean,
isn't.
no. I mean, and Candy, I marvel at the fact that she was able to do that, because so many women and girls are stuck where they are because they are so wrapped up in this abuse, and the lies that they're told, that it's people say, why don't you just leave? Well, that's an easy question, but the answer is complicated. It's not just a matter of leaving. And again, the gaslighting, you start to believe the reality that your abuser wants you to believe. And that belief was that I couldn't be loved by anyone else, and that
Right.
I needed to stay. And of course, and there were times he was very kind and very loving. He would pull me back in at the moments where I felt like I couldn't do this anymore. And all of a sudden the guilt came on. Well, this is God's will, and we need to do this for the church. In spite of the fact that he was married with 2 children, that didn't seem to bother him. But it's such a confusion part of a person. Once you're sucked in, it's very difficult. So hats off to Candy.
Well, absolutely. And, hats off to Candy for sure. And also remember that the manipulation is in order to keep you feeling shame.
Mm-hmm.
So when, church and shame have a pretty tight bond sometimes.
Yeah.
And then you have people who behave in these ways who understand how to manipulate you with that shame. And, you were talking about that with your story, and it is rampant to be shamed when people want you to be feeling less than. They will just say, oh, you're not a very good girl, are you? Look, you don't live the principles. You are not an example of what you say you believe. And husbands will say that to wives, and wives will say that to husbands. And that's spiritual abuse too,
Absolutely.
everybody.
Absolutely.
Remember that if someone is ridiculing or insulting your beliefs, that's spiritual abuse. When they try to prevent you from practicing, I'm reminding everybody about these things from the National Domestic Hotline right now. When they try to prevent you from practicing, that's spiritual abuse. When they use manipulation to shame you, that is using your beliefs to shame you. That is spiritual abuse. And the last one that was on that list, I will reiterate because it's right on target with what we're talking about. They use the beliefs or spiritual text to minimize, rationalize abusive behaviors.
And one of the things my abuser would say is he was like David in the Bible. He had his faults, but God still used him. And that was his rationale, was to twist that scripture to the point that he was just like David, and God used David, and so God's still using him.
And what? Just hearing this story, I want to be like Saul.
Yeah.
Or Solomon, rather.
Yeah.
Solomon.
So
I would like to just split him in
yeah,
half, right?
yeah, right.
All right. So, Ursel wants to know, do you help other women now?
I do. I volunteer for a ministry called the Hope of Survivors Ministry. They deal mostly with adult women who have been spiritually abused by a spiritual leader. And I also want to make the point that it doesn't have to be a pastor, a priest, or a rabbi. Anyone with a spiritual authority within the church can be spiritually abusing, whether it be a choir director, a Sunday school teacher. Those are people in a position of influence, and so they can also be abusive as well. So I talk about spiritual leaders being abusive, but I do some counseling with women. I also do conferences where I talk and tell my story, and then have a question and answer and talk to victims as they come forward and talk to me about it, which has been, I have found that to be so rewarding for me to be able to help someone else, because I truly would have given anything to have had someone in my life at that time who could have shared their story with me.
Absolutely, because you felt so isolated and alone. And that's the hijackal way. Isolate you, marginalize you, shame you so that you won't speak up. Isabel says that's the confusing part when they're also kind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the love bombing. When
It
they get a
is.
little bit afraid that you're going to expose them or leave them, then all of a sudden they become that kind, wonderful, loving, protective person for a hot minute
Mm-hmm.
to get you back. Oh, I wasn't wrong. They do love me. It is all wonderful. So yes, it is confusing, Isabel. And Joan says, plus the setup is effective. You keep lowering your bar while hoping for more and getting less. So
Yeah.
well said,
Oh,
Joan.
that's perfect.
Yeah. Then she says, your body and brain are on a loop. The physiological ramifications are real. Absolutely real. You can actually get quite ill. You know,
Mhm.
I did a podcast last night, and it was on why you're feeling stuck, frozen, and powerless, and talking about the way that we take on energetic charge from this. And when we are being shamed and we are being manipulated, we have nowhere to discharge that charge. And so we can turn it on our bodies and create illnesses and conditions. So it's really important. Kendi said, yes, I'm in therapy trying to overcome guilt and shame. Yes, the manipulation and confusion. They say you are too sensitive. Oh, don't they just say that all the time? Oh, I was just kidding, or you're too sensitive. You
And
take it
everyone
all
thinks
so
you're crazy.
seriously.
Everyone else thinks you're crazy. You overreact and you're dramatic and, yeah.
Yeah.
And when you start to question that, then they go back to the same lies and repeat over and over to the point where, again, your reality becomes their reality. And you don't
Mhm.
trust your own judgment any longer. You no
That's
longer
right.
trust who you are. You don't know who you are. And therefore, you can't even question what's happening around you because you've lost that ability through the trauma.
Yeah, really good point. So Ursel says, is it worse in Orthodox Church?
Well, I think the abuse happens everywhere. It does, when someone asked me what denomination it was, it doesn't matter because it happens in every faith community. It happens in places where there are vulnerable people. We talked, that the gymnast in Michigan, and the U.S. gymnastics team, Boy Scouts, wherever there are vulnerable people, these narcissistic men will find their way. So I think there is maybe in the hierarchy of certain churches, like where women aren't permitted to be
Yeah.
a part. I think it does make that a little bit easier for abuse to happen. The evangelical church has, the belief that you should obey your husbands, be submissive. That certainly adds to the ability for someone to take advantage and abuse spiritually. And they'll
Well,
use that scripture.
absolutely. I had a client once, she called me and she was in terrible pain. She had a kidney stone. And she was just in terrible, terrible pain. But she belonged to a church where the husband was the head of the home and the husband was the leader of the wife. And in such a church, the women were not allowed to teach men, they were only allowed to speak to other women. And she was crying in pain. And he said to her, you are supposed to be a godly, strong woman. I'm not taking you to the hospital.
Yeah.
Right? These things are real.
And they
Isabel,
happen. I mean, it's not, you think this is, in the modern day, that's not going to happen. It happens a lot now in churches where that is the mindset that, the men are in charge and you're to obey. And I've had women say to me, my pastors, I've told him I was being sexually or physically abused, and they told me I needed to try harder. I needed to try
try
harder.
what harder?
Right.
You
Exactly.
know, so
Yeah.
difficult. Oh, we got lots here. Um, uh, when Isabel said, I heard you're too sensitive, Ursel responded, I heard that from my psychiatrist. Oh,
Find
that
another
is terrible.
psychiatrist. Yeah.
Well, that's what Isabel said. Maybe get another psychiatrist. And Ursel said, I did immediately. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you took care of yourself. It is terrible, Isabel, for sure. And Ursel said, my grandfather used to say church was made to control women.
Mm.
Ooh, that's overt. They
Mhm.
don't usually say, maybe your grandfather could see things that
Yeah.
very clearly in those cases, because certainly there are many that control women, and we see documentaries on them all the time.
Yeah.
So that's actually true. So when we do these Facebook Lives, I usually make this announcement about this time, which is, of course, that two things. If anybody wants to get in touch with Sandy, I have shown you where to find her at sandyphillipskirkham.com. Phillips with two L's, sandyphillipskirkham.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you find me at forrelationshiphelp.com, forrelationshiphelp.com. But the other thing that I need to say is this: when we have no more comments or questions in the box for 30 seconds, I believe that you have heard all that you need to and had the opportunity to say everything that you might want to say to Sandy or I. So if you have a question or you're sitting on a comment, please put it in the chat now so that we don't miss it, because we wouldn't like to miss it. Isabel said, that's the narc pastor. There is a pecking order. And Kindy says, God is real and deals with real issues. Don't let anyone tell you it's God's will to be abused, because it's not, right?
Absolutely.
And I once had a spiritual teacher who said to me, never pray for something you can do something about.
Very good.
Right?
Very
So
good. Yeah.
abuse is something you can do something about. Even if you're feeling disempowered, even if someone's telling you no one will believe you, I hope you find some strength today in Sandy's story to be able to say, no, this is
Mhm.
not okay with me on any level. And even if you're shaking with trepidation, tell somebody, tell many
Absolutely.
somebodies. Absolutely do that. So,
Mhm.
anything that you would like to share that we haven't got round to, Sandy?
I think we've done a good job of covering a lot of bases here. I do want to say to victims that what is being done to you is not right and it's not your fault. So many victims feel like they've deserved this, that they've done something that, or if they've done something differently, it wouldn't have happened. It's not your fault. And I agree that you need to tell someone. I spent 27 years keeping this secret. So I totally understand how difficult it is to be able to voice that. But that's the only way the healing can begin, is when you begin to say the words, I'm being sexually abused or abused physically or emotionally.
Absolutely. And don't think that by saying that it makes you weak or
Right.
dumb or anything. It doesn't. Someone is using you, and you need to speak up. They're using you, which is abusing you,
Yes.
and you need to speak up. No shame on you. They are not to be doing that. And so Ursel says, how have you changed yourself, Sandy?
Well, for years that I kept this secret, I walked around with the impostor syndrome, meaning I knew that if anyone really knew what I had done in my past, that I'd been kicked out of a church, that they would think differently of me, and that I really wasn't who they thought I was. And that was difficult to live with, because I always felt like I had to prove myself.
Right.
And now I understand that any guilt and shame that I felt squarely belonged on my abuser. And that allowed, I mean, I had a wonderful husband. I had two great kids. From the outside, my life looked wonderful. And in many ways it was. But carrying that secret was damaging to my heart and to my soul. And once I was able to let go of that guilt and shame, I could live the life that I was meant to live. And I no longer have that guilt and shame. I am not embarrassed in any way to say that I was sexually abused by my youth pastor. And for a long time, I couldn't say those words. I was fearful of those words. And the cliche that truth set me free really, really is true for me.
That's great. And that's encouraging to others to know that you can go from feeling what you expressed before to feeling empowered.
Right.
I have a membership program for people who want to feel that. And it's called Emerging Empowered Community. Everybody's welcome to joinintoday.com. Come on over. There's a great safe place off any social media, safely on my website. They have lots of streams of conversation. Membership gives you 2 group Ask Me Anything calls a month with me. So many good things there. Gifts every 3 weeks for you. So much for you. So if you're looking for a safe place to talk about these things, come on over to joinintoday.com. And people are still asking us questions. So let's hear what they have to say. So Isabel said, would you suggest no contact with this narc pastor? He is my brother. I actually got chest pains from his abuse. I know the answer, actually.
I do too. I
So
think we
we're
have
going
the
to
same.
say together, no contact.
None, none.
No, because we don't let abusive people contact us. It
No.
is simply off limits. And if he tries, if you need to, if he's pushy, if he's difficult, if he is behaving inappropriately, don't be afraid to report him.
He has proven by his own behavior he does not deserve your attention, your love, or any kind of commitment or any kind of attraction, anything with him at all. I mean, he's
No, and no consideration for his tarnishing reputation. He's a big boy and he's choosing what he's doing.
right.
So that has consequences and let him experience
Yes.
them, right? Um, Ranch Girl, hello, said, I left my husband and feel guilty as he always said, God has a great plan for us. He always threw God into the mix. There we have it, the spiritual abuse. I'm going to corral you in by a greater power than I am has brought us together, and therefore you should put up with how I treat you.
No.
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 No. We will say that all of us together. No.
Oh.
No, and that is one of the ways that people like to be inclusive, "Oh, well, we're in this together. God has brought us together for a purpose, and we don't know. It's working its way out in mysterious ways while I abuse you."
Mm-hmm.
No, all those things may well be true, but they are not related to allowing somebody to abuse you.
Correct.
Yes, we're not having that one. No, 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 no.
Mm-mm.
Uh, Simply Savvy says, "Oh man, I'm late. Another amazing, great topic." Well, you can always listen to it again because it's here on my Facebook page, and it's also on YouTube, so you can listen to it. Kendi says, "Thank you, ladies, so much. I'm so grateful, and you're so welcome, Kendi." Ranch Girl said he wouldn't acknowledge the pain he has caused and take responsibility and just tell me what is in the past is in the past. Yeah, we've talked about that one, haven't we, Sandy?
Mm-hmm. They're not going to acknowledge that they have any fault in any of that.
No,
It's
not at all.
no, they're not going to do that. It's not in their wheelhouse and in their realm of who they are.
No, and that goes for any kind of abuse and any kind of hijackal of any stripe is never going to acknowledge that they have a flaw, that they made a mistake, that they were wrong. It's always going to be the blame shift. It's always going to be coming right back at you like a boomerang.
Mm-hmm.
And don't believe that.
No.
Just don't believe it. Simply Savvy said, I sought truth in the church and religion, but it was also used as a club, even pastoral counseling for our marriage ended up being toxic and used in the wrong way. I have seen that happen
Yes.
on many occasions. So we're with you, Simply Savvy. Pastoral and couple counseling doesn't work when one is using and abusing it rather than doing the work. You are so right.
Mm-hmm.
No counseling works when somebody is using and abusing it. Isabel says, thank you. And Simply Savvy says, my experience with fundamental Baptist counseling, quote unquote, the woman needs to put up with abuse and be perfect, unquote. Not much accountability for the man wreaking all the havoc.
Yeah.
Not at all.
No.
No. And Ranch Girl says, thanks. I needed confirmation that I wasn't the crazy one. I know God loves me and God loves me the way I am. Yes. Free,
Absolutely.
intelligent, safe, keeping yourself safe because you can. Great. It's all really good. So we could go on for a long, long time on this topic, and maybe we'll do it again. But I want to thank you, Sandy, for being my guest today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's been a good discussion. And it is important for other people to hear, as someone who's been through it to be able to say, there is hope and healing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's so good for people to hear your story, and I'm so glad. We've been talking about spiritual abuse, sad, real, and betraying today, and my guest is Sandy Phillips Kirkham. You want to read her book, and you want to go and visit her website. If you have a venue, invite her to speak. so that she can share her experience and her empowerment to leave that experience and get it out of her system and do all that she needed to do to keep other people safe by telling her story. I'm so glad that you were here. I'm Dr. Roberta Shaler. You find me at forrelationshiphelp.com. And if you want to be part of my emerging empowered community, come on over. We'd love to have you safely off any kind of social media at joinintoday.com. So till we speak again, treat yourself very well because you're precious and you matter. Talk soon.